shot in self-defense, boom, boom, boom. You know, they weren't cut up, they weren't sliced up, no OJ jazz, you know. And he said, I did the most horrendous crime in the whole wide world.
In the late 1980s, Florida's highways became the hunting ground of a rare type of criminal, a female serial killer. Aileen Wuornos' story is a dark tale of abandonment, abuse, and survival. Born in 1956, her life began with tragedy. Her father was a convicted sex offender who died by suicide in prison, and her mother abandoned her before age 5. She was raised by her grandparents, but the environment remained volatile. By the age of 14, Aileen was pregnant after being raped. She was soon expelled from the home, left to survive on her own in Michigan's woods, often sleeping in abandoned cars and exchanging sex for basic needs. This brutal, broken childhood forged a woman who trusted no one and was consumed by rage. By her 20s, she relocated to Florida, working as a sex worker near major highways. She offered rides and companionship to truckers and travelers, none of whom suspected the deep, festering darkness that lay beneath her troubled exterior. She was on the edge of a violent spree that would shock the nation. Between 1989 and 1990, Aileen Wuornos murdered at least 7 men. Her method was simple and cold-blooded. She would lure her victims into her car under the guise of sex. Once she had them isolated, she would pull out a gun and shoot them point-blank. She then systematically robbed them of cash and stole their vehicles before dumping their bodies in remote areas, often shot multiple times. When police eventually connected the string of missing men and recovered bodies, Aileen insisted she was not a killer, but a victim fighting back. She claimed every man she shot had attempted to rape her, and she was acting in self-defense. However, prosecutors countered this by highlighting the cold efficiency of her actions. She did not just defend herself, she robbed her victims and repeated the same predatory pattern again and again. To the state, the evidence, the theft, the disposal of the bodies, and the calculated nature of the crimes indicated calculated murder, driven by rage rather than mere survival. The trial of Aileen Wuornos was dominated by her highly erratic and explosive behavior. She frequently screamed at the judge and jury, cursed the cameras, and showed no visible remorse. This lack of control was unusual for a defendant and helped solidify the public's perception of her as a pure monster. Crucially, the investigation led detectives to Tyria Moore, Aileen's girlfriend and the one stable relationship in her life. Investigators granted Moore immunity in exchange for her cooperation. Moore then made a series of recorded phone calls to Aileen. Believing she was protecting Moore from legal trouble, Aileen confessed in detail to the murders, insisting that she alone was responsible. These recorded conversations were devastating, becoming the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The recordings completely undermined her self-defense claims, confirming that the killings were part of a larger criminal enterprise. Tyria Moore later testified against her, sealing Aileen's fate. In 1992, Aileen Wuornos was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death. She spent the next decade on Florida's death row, descending into deep paranoia and delusion. She accused authorities of letting her continue killing to profit from her story, and claimed she was being targeted by bizarre, complex weaponry. Her final years were marked by continuous bizarre behavior. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. Her final words were a strange, unhinged declaration. "I'll be back, like Independence Day with Jesus, big mothership and all." Wuornos became a cultural phenomenon, the subject of books, documentaries, and the Oscar-winning film Monster. Her legacy remains a painful debate. Was she truly an irredeemable monster who preyed on men, or a victim of lifelong abuse who ultimately snapped and lashed out against society? Her story is a chilling reminder of the complexity of evil and the extreme violence that can be born from profound betrayal and trauma.
Окончательное наказание. Чикатило на основании статьи 40 Уголовного кодекса Российской Федерации.
In the crumbling Soviet Union of the 1970s and 1980s, a monster stalked the countryside. Andrei Chikatilo. He would become known as the Butcher of Rostov and the Red Ripper. Chikatilo was born in 1936 in Ukraine, an area ravaged by famine under Stalin's rule. His childhood was marked by intense poverty, humiliation, and a terrifying rumor that his older brother had been kidnapped and eaten during the Holodomor, a trauma that haunted his family. Compounding his distress, Chikatilo struggled with chronic impotence, a condition that filled him with profound shame and rage. On the surface, he appeared unremarkable. He was a married schoolteacher and later a clerk, father of 2 children. But beneath this mundane facade, his dark, violent urges festered. These frustrations and deep inadequacy twisted into a need for sexual release through extreme violence, leading him toward his first known murder in 1978. From 1978 to 1990, Chikatilo terrorized the Soviet Union, killing at least 52 people, though some estimates are higher. His victims were often the most vulnerable: runaways, school children, and women, whom he would lure near bus or train stations with promises of food or work. Once secluded, he unleashed violence that defied human comprehension. He frequently stabbed and mutilated his victims dozens of times, often targeting the eyes and abdomen. In many cases, he committed acts of cannibalism. Investigators noted the scene looked less like murder and more like butchery. The Soviet system's reluctance to admit a serial killer was loose, fearing it would expose weakness and panic, was a tragic failure. Authorities were often pressured to close cases quickly, sometimes charging innocent men to maintain the illusion of order. This systemic denial allowed Chikatilo to flourish, hunting with confidence that the bureaucracy would protect him. By the late 1980s, the pattern of bodies found near rail lines was undeniable, forcing authorities to assemble a task force. The breakthrough finally came in 1990. Undercover officers spotted Chikatilo behaving suspiciously near a train station, approaching young women. They detained him and found incriminating evidence, including a knife, rope, and suspicious stains on his clothing. A search of his home uncovered his private diaries, which were filled with notes detailing his crimes. At first, Chikatilo denied everything, but after days of intense interrogation, he broke. In chilling detail, he confessed to dozens of murders, describing each attack with unnerving precision. He admitted the killings gave him sexual satisfaction and that stabbing and mutilating his victims was a compensation for his impotence. His confession and profound lack of remorse stunned investigators, confirming that they had finally caught one of the world's most brutal mass murderers. Chikatilo's 1992 trial became an international spectacle. He was placed behind the glass of a reinforced cage where he ranted, shouted, and even exposed himself in court. Families of the victims screamed and cursed him as prosecutors detailed the horrors he inflicted. The press dubbed him the Red Ripper, cementing his place in true crime infamy. The jury found him guilty of 52 murders. The judge famously declared, "This monster is not a man, he deserves to be executed." On February 14, 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head in a Russian prison. His death brought a wave of relief, but also left a haunting legacy. His story is a powerful reminder of how political bureaucracy and denial allowed a monster to flourish, and how the system's failure to protect its most vulnerable citizens led to a staggering and horrific body count. Anthony Sowell's method was horrifyingly consistent. He specifically targeted women who were already vulnerable, many struggling with addiction or homelessness. He would invite them into his home, offering food, alcohol, or a temporary place to sleep. Once inside, the pretense of kindness vanished, and he would turn predator. He would typically strangle his victims, sometimes with a cord, other times with his bare hands. After the murder, he hid the bodies throughout the property to conceal his horrific actions. Some victims were buried in shallow graves in the backyard, while others were left in crawl spaces or covered up in upstairs rooms. For years, the House of Horrors stood just a few feet away from families going about their daily lives. The victims disappeared one by one. Their families filed missing persons reports, but often these disappearances went unnoticed or were treated as low-priority cases by authorities because the women came from marginalized communities. This societal indifference allowed Sowell to keep killing, confident that no one would look too closely. Everything changed in September 2009. A woman named Latundra Billups accused Sowell of luring her into his house, attempting to strangle her and raping her. She managed to escape and went directly to the police, providing the key evidence detectives needed. Officers obtained a search warrant, and on October 29th, they entered the Imperial Avenue home. The smell of rotting flesh was immediate and overwhelming. Investigators first found remains in the basement and the backyard. As they continued their meticulous search, more bodies were uncovered in crawl spaces and hidden throughout the house. In total, the remains of 11 women were recovered. Some had been dead for years, so badly decomposed that identification took months, relying heavily on DNA and dental records. The house itself was grotesque, covered in stains and biological fluids. When Sowell was arrested, his reaction was chilling. He showed no remorse, claiming he couldn't remember killing so many women, blaming drugs and alcohol. However, prosecutors argued it was cold, methodical murder, not a blackout, as he controlled, killed, and disposed of his victims like trash. The trial in 2011 was one of the most disturbing in Ohio's history. Family members of the victims filled the courtroom, clutching photographs of their lost daughters and sisters. Prosecutors presented gruesome forensic evidence and testimony from the survivors. The defense pleaded for mercy, citing brain damage and alcohol abuse, suggesting life in prison. But the jury was not swayed by the excuses. They convicted Anthony Sowell on 82 charges, including aggravated murder and rape, and recommended the death penalty. On August 12, 2011, Sowell was formally sentenced to die. He spent the next decade on death row. In February 2021, before his execution date arrived, Anthony Sowell died of a terminal illness while confined to his cell. The case raised brutal, uncomfortable questions about how the system failed for so long. Neighbors complained for years, and families begged for help, yet the lives of the marginalized victims were treated as disposable. Today, the house has been demolished, and the lot where it once stood is empty. But the memory remains a scar on the Cleveland community.
Straight most any day. Some of these might be familiar, so sit up straight when I talk to you. How was your life right before you murdered my sister?
In November 2022, America woke up to one of the most chilling crime stories in recent memory. 4 University of Idaho college students, Ethan Chapin, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Kaylee Gonzalez, were found brutally stabbed to death inside their off-campus house in Moscow, Idaho. The murders shocked the nation, not just because of their brutality, but because they happened in a quiet college town, a place people believed was safe. The attack occurred in the early hours of November 13, 2022. Investigators believe the killer crept into the house armed with a large knife, moving room to room and killing the students with surgical precision. The scene was one of the most gruesome the county coroner had ever witnessed. 2 roommates survived the attack, one of whom saw a masked man walking out of the house that night. For weeks, the case terrified the community, fueling endless speculation and fear as police released very little information. Everyone wanted to know, who could commit such a calculated and brutal act, and why? The answer came 6 weeks later on December 30th, 2022. Police arrested 28-year-old Bryan Kohberger at his parents' home in Pennsylvania. The suspect was not a drifter or an outsider. He was a criminology PhD student at Washington State University, located just a short drive across the border from Moscow, Idaho. The irony was immediate and terrifying. A man who studied the psychology of killers was now allegedly one himself. Kohberger had studied criminal behavior, profiling, and forensic psychology, the very tools investigators used to catch him. The evidence against him was damning. Detectives found his DNA on a knife sheath left on one of the victims' beds. Furthermore, surveillance cameras captured his white Hyundai Elantra circling the neighborhood on the night of the murders. Phone records also placed him near the crime scene multiple times in the weeks leading up to the killings, suggesting he had stalked the victims.
The details that emerged painted a picture of calculated deception. Investigators alleged that Kohberger had followed some of the victims on social media. His actions on the night of the murders showed an attempt to evade detection, which instead highlighted his movements. He left his cell phone turned off during the hours of the attacks, only to turn it back on as he drove home. Even more disturbing, after the murders, he allegedly returned to the crime scene in the days that followed, driving past the house as though reliving what he had done. Former classmates described Kohberger as awkward, controlling, and intensely critical, often dominating classroom discussions on the minds of killers. His arrest shocked the nation. How could a man who should have understood law enforcement tactics commit such a crime and think he could get away with it? The blend of intellectual arrogance and brutal violence made his case uniquely disturbing.
Kohberger was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. His trial became one of the most anticipated in years, drawing intense national scrutiny. After months of legal maneuvers, in July 2025, Bryan Kohberger reportedly entered a plea agreement. He admitted to the murders of all 4 students, receiving 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. By pleading guilty, he avoided the death penalty, a decision that sparked fierce debate about justice. For many, the outcome was unsatisfying. 4 young lives were cut short in the most brutal way imaginable, yet the killer would live out his life behind bars. The case shattered the illusion of safety in small-town America. Kohberger will never walk free again, stripped of the control he once craved. But the chilling questions remain. Why did he do it? What was the true motive? Was it a violent fantasy, a test of his own intelligence, or pure sadism? The world may never fully know.
Your Honor, it is over now. This has never been a case of trying to get free.
In the summer of 1991, Milwaukee police entered an ordinary apartment that hid a nightmare so grotesque it scarred America forever. It was the residence of Jeffrey Dahmer, the man who became infamous as the Milwaukee Cannibal. Dahmer's crimes went far beyond simple murder. Over 13 years, he lured, drugged, strangled, dismembered, and in some cases, consumed parts of 17 young men and boys. Dahmer was born in 1960 and was described as shy and withdrawn. From an early age, he showed a disturbing obsession with dead animals, which he would collect and dissect in his backyard. His teenage years were marked by isolation and heavy alcoholism. But beneath this troubled exterior, dark fantasies of total control over others were brewing. His deep-seated urges, fueled by psychological isolation, finally erupted in 1978. Just after high school, he committed his first murder, killing a hitchhiker he had brought home, and then crushing and scattering the bones in the woods. For nearly a decade, Dahmer kept his urges hidden, passing through a brief stint in the army before the darkness fully took. Dahmer's killing spree accelerated in 1987 when he began targeting gay bars and bathhouses in Milwaukee. He offered men money or drinks in exchange for company, luring them back to his apartment, which would become his house of horrors. Once there, he drugged and strangled them. His depravity didn't stop at murder. He engaged in necrophilia and, most famously, cannibalism, consuming parts of his victims to make them a permanent part of himself. He kept skulls and bones as trophies, storing body parts in his refrigerator and freezer. Detectives later found human heads in the fridge and hearts and genitals preserved in jars. Even more chilling were his attempts to create living, submissive zombies by drilling holes into his victims' skulls and pouring acid or boiling water inside while they were still alive, attempts that all ended in death. Astonishingly, neighbors often complained about this strange, foul smells coming from his apartment, but Dahmer simply dismissed it as spoiled meat, allowing him to continue his reign of terror. The system failed to stop Dahmer despite having clear opportunities. The most infamous failure occurred in May 1991, when Conrad Balasomi, a 14-year-old boy, escaped Dahmer's apartment, half naked and bleeding. Neighbors frantically called the police. When officers arrived, Dahmer calmly convinced them that the boy was his 19-year-old lover, and they had simply argued. Shockingly, the police believed him and escorted the terrified boy back into Dahmer's apartment. Hours later, Konarak was dead. Dahmer's reign of terror finally ended just 2 months later, on July 22, 1991. Another intended victim, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape the apartment with one wrist still in handcuffs and flagged down police. When officers entered Dahmer's home, the overpowering smell hit them first, followed by the gruesome discovery of mutilated body photographs, and finally, a human head staring back at them from the refrigerator. Dahmer was arrested and quickly confessed, speaking with chilling calmness as he detailed all 17 murders. Dahmer's 1992 trial was a massive media circus, with victims' families listening in horror as the grotesque details of his acts were revealed. The defense argued that the extreme nature of his crimes proved he was insane. However, the jury rejected the insanity plea, finding him legally sane and guilty on 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, totaling nearly 1,000 years in prison. Dahmer accepted the verdict, stating he was prepared for the maximum sentence. However, prison would not be his final resting place. On November 28, 1994, after serving only 2 years, Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, in a Wisconsin prison bathroom. Scarver later stated he killed Dahmer because of his crimes. Even in death, Dahmer remains one of the most infamous names in crime history. His story a chilling reminder that evil can live in an ordinary apartment on an ordinary street, completely hidden from the unsuspecting world.
Tell you is what I know is fact.
I'm a power person. I enjoy power. Nobody else had the guts to pull off.
John Wayne Gacy was like your typical suburban guy in Chicago. He was a straight shooter, a business owner running PDM contractors, and a community pillar, even a Democrat precinct captain. But the main thing everyone remembers is that he was a volunteer clown named Pogo who entertained kids at hospitals and fundraisers. On the surface, he was a good sport and a stand-up guy. But underneath that happy mask, he was a sicko. Gacy was dealing with deep internal issues, including struggles with his sexuality and a huge craving for respect and control. He'd already done time for sexual assault back in Iowa in the late 60s, but he came back to Chicago, cleaned up his act, publicly anyway, and fooled every single person he met. This terrifying double life, the friendly neighbor versus the monster, is what makes his story so utterly bonkers. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy was on a tear, raping, torturing, and murdering at least 33 teenage boys and young men. His victims were often runaways or kids he lured with promises of job offers or quick cash. His MO, modus operandi, was twisted. He'd use a sinister magic trick, convincing his victims to try on handcuffs for a laugh. Once they were restrained, the fun and games were over, and the horror began. He would then assault and strangle them. The most gnarly part? He buried 29 of his victims in the crawl space beneath his own suburban home. The stink eventually got so bad that neighbors complained, but Gacy always had some lame excuse, like plumbing problems. He thrived because back then, cops often dismissed missing boys as simple runaways, letting Gacy literally get away with murder right under their noses for years. Gacy's whole jig was up in December 1978 when 15-year-old Robert Peast vanished after telling his mom he was meeting Gacy about a job. This time, the cops didn't screw around. They got a search warrant for Gacy's home, and what they found was beyond gory. They unearthed body after body from the crawl space. The sheer scale of the killings blew everyone's mind. 4 other victims were found in nearby rivers. Gacy was quickly arrested, and the media went ballistic, instantly dubbing him the Killer Clown. His arrest exposed the monstrous secret he had been hiding while performing as pogo and shaking hands with politicians. The contrast was so freaky that his story became a global media frenzy, forever cementing his place in true crime infamy. Gacy's 1980 trial was a spectacle. The defense tried to pull the insanity card, claiming that Jack, an alternate personality, committed the murders. The jury wasn't buying that malarkey for a second. They convicted him on 33 counts of murder, the most for any one person in the U.S. at that time. He was sentenced to death. For the next 14 years on death row, Gacy was still messing with people, even painting portraits of clowns that sold to morbid collectors. He had major nerve, once claiming he shouldn't have been convicted for anything more than running a cemetery without a license. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Outside the prison, crowds were losing it, celebrating the end of the monster. Gacy's legacy is a permanent mind-bender, a reminder that the most devastating evil can look like the friendly neighbor who waves at you while mowing his lawn.